Once upon a time, the Greater Horseshoe Bat was abundant across England, but it's now suffered a loss of over half its range. It's one of the rarest species that we have in the UK. But Devon has about a third of that UK population, as well as having some of the biggest roosts in Europe, which makes the region a real stronghold. An old shed, unused for 30 years, sits isolated and useless, and perhaps the perfect site for a Greater Horseshoe Bat roost. Philip Bolt, a member of the Hoyle Copse volunteers in Stoke Gabriel, Devon, gave birth to the idea of a wildlife haven.
This was given to the village by Miss Birch. She owned the cottages down below and the copse. Lots of children used to come up here to play anyway, and she specifically left this to the parish council for the enjoyment and recreation of parishioners. But we've got to bear in mind, parishioners consist of humans and wildlife. So the two together, you've got to be pragmatic and get that balance between the two. The project's funded by the Devon Wildlife Trust plus Southampton District Council, and it is targeted for the Greater Horseshoe Bat. So for example, the cutting we make in the side of the shed for the bats to fly in is large enough for the Greater Horseshoe because they are probably the biggest bat in the UK. So there's little custom things like that, but who knows what we're going to get there.
So Greater Horseshoe bats, like many mammals and many species in the UK, are under threat through various things that are sort of impacting on the landscape. So one of the main ones for bats, but also bird species as well, is the loss of insect diversity and abundance in our landscape. And the reasons for that are quite complex, but often it is to do with sort of intensification of agriculture, for example. So previously in the last few decades, back in the 70s and 80s, a lot of hedgerows were taken out, and that meant that bats couldn't actually access their feeding grounds particularly well because they have sort of lost their highway system in the landscape. But it also meant that there were fewer places for insects to congregate as well. There's been an increase in the use of pesticides and herbicides, and a reduction in our sort of permanent pasture areas where you'd expect to find lots of wildflowers which support insects and pollinators and the sorts of things that Greater Horseshoe bats will be feeding on. So we've sort of lost the habitat, we've also lost the food source as well. So the estimations at the moment are that the UK population is about 12,500, and that's adult bats. So it's one of the rarest species that we have in the UK. But here in Devon, the thought is that we've got about a third of that UK population, which makes Devon a real stronghold. And some of the roosts near here are actually the biggest roosts in Europe. So not only is this a UK stronghold, but it's also a stronghold for the whole of this sort of region, so the European region. Well, near to here there's a roost that's really big that has about 2,000 or 3,000 bats in the summer, which is insane. More commonly you'd have maybe a few dozen or maybe a few hundred, but that makes them really vulnerable. So if something happens to those roosts, then you could potentially be wiping out a massive population, and that has a real implication for the whole, UK population.
There are 18 species of bat in Britain, and all are protected under the Wildlife Countryside Act. British bats eat insects and nothing else, which means they keep insect numbers in check. The Greater Horseshoe is the size of a small pear. They're known for their fleshy nose that's shaped like a horseshoe. Its fur is reddish brown on its back and cream underneath. The Greater Horseshoe Bat was once a cave dweller, but now they tend to roost in old houses, in barns and in churches. In early summer, they will emerge at dusk and dawn.
Right, so this is the wildflower meadow. The definition of a meadow is normally a poor piece of ground which is stripped from the fodder every year. It impoverishes the ground, no cattle normally graze on it, and that then allows the wildflowers to come through. We've planted yellow rattle, and the yellow rattle is suppresses the grass to encourage the wildflowers. Just over this area here we had over 120 pyramid orchids late this summer, which is brilliant.
Wow.
The whole copse is 7 acres, which is approximately 1 acre meadow, 7 acres of woodland. The woodland you can define into 3 pieces. You've got the heritage hawthorn area, as we call it, which is growing parallel to the field. Down below later on you see the hazel area, and the hawthorn in the hazel was grown to feed the lime kiln. Here's the shed.
This is the famous shed.
Yes. We got 2 doors, so we started renovation. We had ivy growing right up over the roof, and the roof, you can see there's a bow in the roof. We started to straighten it out a bit, but the roof was starting to collapse. It had undersized timbers that were rotten, so we're in the process of reinforcing the roof so that we can let this ivy go right over the top, which would be a great wildlife sanctuary in its own rights. And we're dividing the shed into 3 sections. A storage area just for our maintenance tools, a bat roost for the Greater Horseshoe Bat, and then a wildlife haven. I'll show you inside. This is going to be the bat roost. There'll be a hole cut out there. The bats will fly in, and there's a big debate, you know, we're discussing with Devon Wildlife Trust. Do we make this section here insulated or not insulated? So what we decided to do, we've got so much space, we'll have an uninsulated section, which is here, and then the bats can fly in, and we'll have lots of battens so they can hang from there, or they fly underneath here, and then this section we're putting a loft in with a hole underneath so the bats can fly in up into the loft. There's the insulation material, so we're going to insulate this section, so the bats can then choose insulated, not insulated. It's almost as good as having central heating. So the second wall will come here, and then all of this area is the wildlife haven. So what we're going to do is we've sealed off the opening that was at the bottom, but we've removed the gable at the top. So that's a flight path, so birds, bats, etc. can also come in this way. We're going to knock blocks out at ground level on both sides. They'll be bricked up to a size where hedgehogs can get through and smaller creatures, but badgers and foxes can't get through. And then all of this area will have different nesting habitats, hibernation habitats. You can see some of the old ivy we've maintained. We're going to make bundles of that up. We're going to bring in a couple of bales of straw. We'll put ledges all the way along with like nesting shelves, things like that. And we're going to build a barn owl box as well. So hopefully we'll have a barn owl fly in as well. Fingers crossed.
The team is hard at work. There's a lot to do, but they work with a smile on their face. There's such a sense of pride and commitment, and a great team working spirit. They're clearing areas under the instruction of the Wildlife Trust. They've planted trees provided by the Woodland Trust. And they're creating lots of habitats as well as enhancing them.
So we're going to use these to dress the walls.
They're wallpapering the walls with hazel and making houses for a variety of bird species such as robins, great tits and swallows. They've used a lot of the brash to make bug hotels and hibernation chambers.
Each year when we cut it, we'll just wheelbarrow it in here and spread it out, so we just get a continuous mush.
It's hard to say when the shed will be used by wildlife. Some species take longer to move in. It depends on all the factors going on in and around the landscape. You wouldn't expect it to become a really happening place straight away. But over the course of the next few years, as it becomes well known in the landscape to all the different species, it will more than likely become a popular destination.
The Wildlife Haven, we've put in every type of nesting, hibernation things you can think about. Everything for grass snakes, lodeworms and toads, hedgehogs, loads of bird boxes, bat boxes. And it's one of these things, you put in all these habitats and you just wait for something to turn up. We had some slowdown due to the pandemic, but it was just finding the right time. Once we actually pulled the trigger, we got the funding for the materials. Once we had purchased the materials, it took us about 5 months to actually build out the shed. And most of that wasn't that visible. Inside, it's all these brand new timbers that can take the way to the roof. Then we had to build the partition walls to separate the shed from the bat roost from the Wildlife Haven. We had to put the insulated loft in for the bat roost as well. We've cut out holes along the bottom for hedgehogs, slowworms, snakes. We get grass snakes in the meadow here to go in, and then the flight paths for the bats as well, which is on the woodland side, hidden from the meadow.
This project here, where we are in Stoke Gabriel, is a really lovely little project because one of the main threats to the Greater Horseshoe Bat is actually where they roost. So roost sites for Greater Horseshoe Bats, unlike some other species that might just roost in you know, like the eaves of buildings and in like bits of tree bark, Greater Horseshoe Bats and lesser horseshoe bats, they need a nice big open space. And so buildings, and in particular sort of traditional barns, are actually really important for them. And those sorts of sites have been lost in the landscape over the course of the last 100 or so years. So the Greater Horseshoe Bat's population has declined by about 90% over the last century. It's beginning to slightly tick up again now with all the sort of effort that's been put into their conservation. But what they really need are spaces that they can roost in safely. And they need a nice big open space, a bit like what we have here. And they need to have some dark areas, and they need it to be without too much disturbance. And so what's being provided here for the horseshoe bats is just perfect for that. So hopefully they will be able to move in quite soon and be able to make it their own home. And they might want to use it for a maternity roost, which is where all the bats come together in the summer, the female bats, and where they will raise what they call their pups, which is the baby bats. Or they might just use it as a feeding roost where they will go out into the countryside and they'll find some nice insects to eat, come back in and digest their food and then fly off again. Both are really important, but it would be amazing if it did become a maternity roost eventually. That would just be like gold standard, so fingers crossed.
Rewilding is a fast-growing movement. It was developed as a method to preserve functional ecosystems and reduce biodiversity loss. It's about enabling natural processes to repair ecosystems and creating wilder, more biodiverse habitats.
In the ideal world, it'd be brilliant to walk away, but we've only got 7 acres here. There's a brilliant book on wilding by Isabella Tree. They had 3,500 acres. When you've got 3,500 acres to rewild, you can do things differently. So here, you try to optimize it. One of the bits of advice we got from Devon Wildlife Trust is you have to help woodland regenerate. Now, when you've got hundreds or thousands of acres of woodland, you leave it to itself. When you've got a small piece of woodland, we get a large tree fall down, we replant around the base of that tree very quickly. You can gain 10, 20, 30 years on the regeneration cycle by doing that. So all we're doing is helping regenerate. As for the meadow, what's essential for meadow and wildflowers is to suppress the grass. Apart from doing an annual cut, and as I said, the only other bit really is about 15 acres of the woodland, which is Hazel, we need to copse that on a 7 to 10 year rotating cycle, but apart from that, minimal maintenance. Just let nature do its own thing. We're very, very pleased, very proud. A lot of people talk about wildlife, but you get a real sense of achievement having done something practical. It all comes to doing something practical to help wildlife. So we've built the Wildlife Haven. If you look at this field here, this is the 1.5 acre meadow. You can see it's now a luxurious wildflower meadow. We started off by seeding it with yellow rattle. That helps suppress the grass, and then along comes the other plants. You've got to think from a wildlife perspective now. If you get down low and you look along, you can see the pollinating insects flying around. You can see loads of insects on the wing, which is great for the insects, because without the insects you wouldn't have the food chain that works all the way up for the wildlife. If I could encourage people to have a small patch in their garden of wildflowers for the pollinating insects, if I can encourage anybody just to put up a little hedgehog box, a bat box, a bird nest box somewhere on the side of their house.
There are loads of things that people can do to help bats. So you can plant sort of pollinator friendly plants in your garden. We've done lots of research through the Bat Project to suggest that bats actually really do use urban areas as long as there are food sources and dark spaces for them to go into. So creating areas where insects will come to, and therefore you'll attract in birds, but also bats as well. If you have a security light on your house, then just think about what the sensitivity is of that. But most bats are what's known as photophobic, so they don't like light. So they come out at night and they want to be able to hunt using echolocation, but if there's a lot of light out there, it disrupts the insects, but it also disrupts their ability to echolocate. So bats aren't so able to hunt and make their way around, and they feel a bit more vulnerable to predators. Other things you can do is think about how you're maintaining hedges, how you're, if you've got trees and things in your garden, making sure that you've got some areas that bats can feed around and hunt around. But certainly putting in bat-friendly species and not having too many lights on at night is something that everyone can do quite easily, I'd say.
If you live in a village or a town and you know of a bit of scrubland, it might be owned by the parish council, or it might be owned by a farmer who doesn't use it. Approach the farmer. I'm also the parish tree warden, and I'm actively looking for plots of land where people want trees. The Woodland Trust will supply the trees, the tree stakes, the tree guards, which are so important, free of charge. Yes, anything to create these better habitats. And by the way, apple orchards are brilliant for bats. You get lots of little hollows in the branches.
Small communities have got so much sway over their local area, and actually thinking locally is a really great way to make things happen. So community groups getting together, managing their grass and verges around roads, just doing all kinds of things just within their local vicinity can have a real impact when it's sort of combined with other people doing the same thing and working together. And it's a great way to get out and about. It's a great way to work with other people and meet like-minded people. And working with community groups is something that I've really enjoyed as part of this project, because people are really interested in their landscape, especially now after the pandemic, and everyone's really got to know where they live so much better.
Well, I've learnt a lot about the other guys who work with me here, work with us here. We all get on well. We're all mostly retired men, finding good use for our time. I've learnt a lot about how to look after wildlife, particularly bats. Amazing things that are being built in here for the bats and the other creatures. But more over the years, we've learned more about how to manage the woodland. We've got a real sense of pride of what we've done, real sense of achievement. We've turned what was just an eyesore and a collapsing shed where the whole roof was about to fall in into something really practical, something really useful for wildlife. And we've already had a visit from one Greater Horseshoe Bat. It's been in and out a few times, and we think that's just going to be the very, very start. We've already got birds nesting in the Wildlife Haven area. We've had slow worms coming in. Only this week we had a meeting with the Torbay Hedgehog Rescue Team. They're looking for donor sites to take rescued hedgehogs. Some hedgehogs they always try to release where they were found, but a lot of the cases they don't know where that is. So they love what we've done in the Wildlife Haven, how we've made the entrances badger and fox proof
but the right size holes for hedgehogs. And they've now going to start releasing hedgehogs here. In fact, I think next week we got the first 6 arriving. Really pleased.
The Hoyle Copse volunteers have transformed a location into a wildlife haven that could potentially increase the Greater Horseshoe Bat population in the UK, as well as many other species of wildlife. Already it's showing signs of success. This project alone proves what a small group can achieve. From just one seed of an idea from one person. Human beings love nature, and as the world emerges from the pandemic, we have a greater sense of our surroundings. But what are you prepared to do to protect it, to enhance it, to nurture it? What do you know about the wildlife in your area? Take action, think wild.